some people arriving, but I think it's probably good if we start on time because I know that Nando has quite a lot to tell us. So today we have our second, as I said, our second Third Thursday webinar. Just so you know, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sheila Heymans. I'm the Executive Director of the Marine Board. And you'll see there the hashtag and for the webinar if you want to tweet about it or something. So it's all there. So some housekeeping rules. First of all, please make sure that you put your name in when you come in, so that if you ask a question, we can actually say who is actually asked the question. So when I ask the question, I can put your name there. If you have any problems with technical problems, you can give it to us in the chat, ask us in the chat, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. But for questions and answers, if you want an actual question on the science, then please put it in the question and answers. And please also try and make sure that you tell us where you're from, what institution, so that we can have that information as well. And I will read out your questions to the speaker at the end of the seminar. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar, so if you don't want anything to be recorded, then don't put anything in the question and answers. And you will be able to see this webinar after the fact on the EMB website and on the YouTube channel, which the link is there. Okay, so what is the talk about today? Well, we're basically focusing today on the talk of our position paper number 24 on Navigating the Future 5. And the talk specifically is looking at one part of it on the cells of ecosystem functioning. And if you haven't read Navigate the Future 5 yet, then you can download it from the website that you see on the screen now. So Navigating the Future 5 was published last year in June, and we launched it at the Eurasian 2019 conference. It basically gives an overview, a big picture overview of what the marine science requirements are into the future, to 2030 and beyond. And it identifies the key topics and themes that are said to be significant in an advance our understanding in the next decade. The specific topic that Nando will be talking about today is in the chapter on the 4D ocean, and as I said, if you haven't read it, it's definitely worth a read. And you'll see here, we have some infographics that go with it. So this is the infographic for the 4D ocean. So without any further ado, let me introduce Professor Ferdinando Boero. He is a professor of zoology at the University of Naples in Italy, and also an associate of the CNR IAS in Genoa, and he represents CONISMA to the European Marine Board. So this talk is going to be based on a paper that he wrote and published in 2019. So I would definitely suggest that you have a look at that paper. So Nando, it's over to you. So if you can put your, perfect, and I will stop sharing my screen. You can start sharing your screen, and I'm going to mute myself now. So it's over to you.
Thanks, Sheila. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay. And it's full screen. Well,
no,
not yet, and now it should be.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I have about an hour, right? A little less. So we leave more space for questions if there will be some. So then the title, as you said, is Cells of Ecosystem Functioning Towards a Holistic Vision of Marine Space. And this comes from the introduction of Navigating the Future 4. You can see it, the sentence that inspired the Navigating the Future 5 is in the introduction of Navigating the Future 4. To truly progress this knowledge, the knowledge generated by marine sciences, European scientists across a broad range of disciplines and domains must make a quantum leap towards holistic approaches and integrated research on a scale which will help us to much better understand, protect, manage, and sustainably exploit the seas and the oceans which surround us. This is a grand challenge, not just for Europe and so on. Unfortunately, in Navigating the Future 4, then the tackling of the topics was much reductionistic. So an holistic approach was invoked, but then it wasn't realized completely, at least. So we made Navigating the Future 5 to satisfy this requirement. The two go together because many of the concepts of Navigating the Future 4 are, of course, still very valid, and we didn't repeat them in Navigating the Future 5, which is an attempt at making a synthesis of what is in Navigating the Future 4. There are many other documents that tackle the problem of holistic approaches to marine sciences. Here you see some I was involved with, but there is, of course, much more than this. In Navigating the Future 5, there is direct reference to the cells of ecosystem functioning. However, to have a truly holistic approach that merges, and these are the disciplines, the main disciplines: physics, chemistry, geology, biology, ecology, and socioeconomics. We have to manage marine ecosystems as units of conservation and management, as cells of ecosystem functioning. They are the smallest fully connected portions, that is volumes, of the marine environment, where biodiversity patterns and ecosystem functions depend on each other. Now we made also the missions. So healthy oceans, seas, coastal and inland waters. The missions have a very specific target, usually, and the paradigmatic mission is man on the moon. Go somewhere and plant a flag on a planet. We need much more than that. It's not a one-shot deal with a single big enterprise to be carried out, but there is a lot of complexity to take into account. Now we are planning to go to Mars, so we are looking for planet B and so on, the exoplanets. Now they say that they found life in the atmosphere of Venus and so on. We keep looking for somewhere else to go, but we have just this planet. The policy of the European Union, as is explained in this other publication of the European Marine Board, evolved from approaches that were focusing first on abiotic features. Then there was the Habitats Directive with habitats and species. But if you look at the Habitats Directive, the marine habitats are just 9, and there are hundreds of terrestrial habitats. And the few marine habitats are all benthic surfaces. The volume is not taken into consideration. In the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, biodiversity and ecosystem functioning framed into a space become the things to look at if we want to preserve, understand and preserve and manage the ocean. So we need to upgrade our ocean observation systems. And this is what this document of the European Marine Board is all about: strengthening Europe's capability in biological ocean observations, because we are very good in physics and biogeochemistry and so on, but not very good in biodiversity and ecosystem functioning yet. These are the indicators of good environmental status in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. The descriptor number 1 is biodiversity. Biodiversity is maintained, and the good environmental status applies not to marine protected areas or networks of marine protected areas. It applies to all European waters. So if we want to maintain biodiversity in all European waters, what else can we ask? By the maintenance and protection of biodiversity is what marine protected areas are all about. But in this case, it's not a specific area, it's all European waters. The other descriptors take into account impacts from non-indigenous species to fish to food webs, eutrophication, the sea bottom integrity, and so on. And these descriptors require that the ecosystems still function properly. So biodiversity and ecosystem functioning are the pillars of good environmental status. This is very far from what we can do. We don't know very well the state of European marine biodiversity. We made a list of the species, ERMS, European Register of Marine Species, but what about knowing the state of conservation of every species? We don't have it. So there is, if we want to maintain biodiversity, we need to know biodiversity. And then we need to know how it interacts with the ecosystems to make them function. This is a plate that shows what current observing systems are all about. They measure mainly physics and biogeochemistry and chemistry. And very often, if the observations are from satellites, they do it on a surface, not on the third dimension. It's not enough. So we need to upgrade this approach and take biodiversity and ecosystems into consideration. The acronym is BIF, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Functioning. So our observation systems must be upgraded so as to comprise also biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And there is a whole lot of different types of expertise. Of course, what is done above is still very necessary, but it's not sufficient. So we need much more to fully understand the functioning, the structure and the function of marine systems. Biodiversity is maintained though, but usually we focus on charismatic expressions of biodiversity and on charismatic habitats, iconic habitats. While doing so, we protect patterns of biodiversity distribution, the hotspots. But with the ecosystem functioning approach, we have to be sure that also the processes that allow for the persistence of biodiversity patterns in hotspots still can continue to persist. So we need to manage and protect both the patterns and the processes. Protected areas usually protect the patterns. So how to frame biodiversity and ecosystem functioning into a spatial context that leads to achieving good environmental status in all waters. Europe has done these things. First of all, recognizing that sustainability is something that we have to reach. And that's why we have Marine Science for a Sustainable Future. The new Green Deal is new just because it calls for a special focus on biodiversity and ecosystems. But there is too much. There is maritime spatial planning, there is marine spatial planning, there are networks of marine protected areas, the sites of community importance, integrated coastal zone management, and then other effective conservation measures. We do many things into the very same space. And very often things are not tackled in an holistic fashion. This is a series of reductionistic approaches to manage and preserve nature. And we need to shift from reductionistic to holistic approaches. Because while you take care of something and you forget the rest, something else might become affected by the something you are doing. So we need to be very aware about the complexity of the system, and we have first of all to understand it, which is still very far from being done. The ocean is one. It covers 71% of the surface of the Earth, but the average depth of the world ocean is 3,500 meters. And this is the third dimension, the volume. If you take the volume, this volume is always occupied by some living forms, from the surface to the very deep trenches. So more than 90% of the life inhabited space is the water column. We cannot consider just surfaces, not the surface of the ocean or the surface of the sea bottom, as the Habitats Directive is doing. We need to know also what is in between these two surfaces. All the waters are connected by the Great Ocean Conveyor. And this shows it better, I presume, than the usual drawing where there is a rectangle and you don't see the whole thing in one shot. The arrows go in a direction, but then they should restart from the left, and this is not very clear. Here you can see it better at the poles. The waters freeze, and if the water freezes, marine water freezes, the sea ice is made of fresh water. The salt is in the water below. And this makes waters denser. They are cold and with high salinity. These waters sink. And so you see the blue arrows that go from the North Pole to the South Pole. In the South Pole, the water freezes again and it goes down and turns around the Antarctic continent. Then the water goes into the Indian Ocean, it surfaces, and then there is a surface current that goes around all the oceans. And from the circumantarctic current, you have also a deep current that goes into the Pacific Ocean. So this connects all the waters of the world ocean. The estimate is that a single molecule of water takes 1,000 years to make the tour of the world. Everything is driven by low temperatures. And so the deep water formation occurs at the poles due to very low temperatures. And these are called the cold engines, because these are the engines that move the water across the world ocean. There are 3 cold engines also in the Mediterranean, which is a miniaturized ocean that repeats the circulation processes of the world ocean. There is no other place on the planet that has these features. So most ecosystem processes take place in the water column. So let's look at what happens in form of pathways. You can see a black circle here with lots of corpses and black arrows that converge there. These are all the living matter that is dead. Living matter before decaying still has an organization. The bacteria that are down on the right below the black circle decompose the dead living matter and produce nutrients. The nutrients feed the microbes that are photosynthetic. And so you see the phytoplankton with the sunlight that produces phytoplankton blooms. The majority of the production on the planet is made by these protists. Other protists, like the protozoans that you see on the left, can feed on the other microbes, both the bacteria and the phytoplankton. This is the microbial pathway. I don't call it a loop because it's open then. But for billions of years, life functioned just in this way before metazoans and higher plants evolved. Every once in a while, it can prevail, the microbial pathway, over the rest of the functioning of ecosystems, and we have noxious algal blooms like the ones you see on the upper right of the drawing. When the metazoans evolved, they started to feed on microbes. And the most important animals of the biosphere are those who feed on these microbes. The very popular ones are copepods. There are also rotifers. There are many others that feed on the microbes, but copepods are the emblem of marine biodiversity. The copepods and the other feeders on the microbes are eaten by fish larvae, for instance. And then the fish, when they grow, start to eat other fish. So the big fish eat the small fish. But in the beginning, they all feed the tiny crustaceans. Then we eat the fish. These microbes, crustaceans, and fish pathway is the one we like the best because we can take resources from it. Another pathway is the herbivorous gelatinous plankton with thaliaceans, filter feeders that can be very large. A chain of salps can be 6 meters long. When they form blooms, they suck all the microbes from the environment, competing with the copepods and with the rest of the food chain. These blooms are sudden, they are massive, but they don't last for a long time. But their occurrence might redirect completely the functioning of the ecosystems, and they are not studied enough. Then there are the carnivorous gelatinous plankton, the mostly cnidarians and ctenophores. These guys feed on the copepods and on the fish larvae, and so on the fish, because if they eat the larvae, then we don't have the adults. We can put everything together, and you see here the main pathways of the functioning of ecosystems in the water column, plus carbon sequestration, because these things die and go to the bottom and become incorporated into the sediments for billions of years, and they become oil or gas, and we extract them and burn them, removing an ecosystem service that is very important, especially in this period of global warming. We need to understand these things, we need to describe them, and then to model them. But before modeling them, we need to understand them. These 4 pathways lead to ecosystem functioning. And this occurs through a series of fluxes that are the processes that link biodiversity structures. The first cycle is life cycles, and I call them intraspecific fluxes. They link one generation to the next. If this link is interrupted, the species becomes extinct. Then there are trophic networks, interspecific fluxes, so from one species to another species, and these are the food webs. And then there are the biogeochemical cycles, the extra-specific fluxes that go from living to non-living matter and back from non-living to living matter. So here they are, inter, and extra-specific fluxes. We have the life cycles that allow the persistence of every species. This is an interspecific flux. So from one species, matter flows to another species. What we do when we eat something, we decompose it in our gut with the aid of bacteria. And then, since we are what we eat, the synthesis of this matter becomes us, at least in part. the rest is for metabolism. Then things die and are decomposed by bacteria. So here you have the main actors: plants, protists, and monerans. Animals and protists, fungi and monera are the responsible of these things. And the monerans, with mineralization, produce the nutrients that by photosynthesis give life back to matter. So in one shot here, you have biogeochemical fluxes, trophic networks, and life cycles. These things must go together. And the system is even more complex than this. Here you have what I just showed, but then all these guys die, not only the animals, though they go to decomposers. There are animals that eat the decomposers, so the secondary producers, and the decomposers give rise to biogeochemical cycles that allow the primary producers to give life back to matter. There are millions of species that do these things. And the millions of species are biodiversity. And this is a very simple graphical model of ecosystem functioning, putting together food webs, life cycles, and biogeochemical cycles. A lot of things to put into the models. I know it's very complex, and this is a simplified version, but if we want to produce reliable models, we have to take these things into consideration, together with biodiversity. Furthermore, if you consider life cycles, you will see that many species are present in some periods and are absent in other periods, especially in the plankton. And there are very many species of plankton that have resting stages. And you can see it in the upper left. So you have the active forms like copepods, phytoplankton, rotifers, and so on. And in the sediments, there are the resting stages. So when these guys disappear, they are in the benthos. So plankton and benthos go together. If we look at the water column, we see mostly fish. We don't see plants because the plants are microscopic. So we have a biased vision of the marine systems because we much focus on carnivores and on fish. But the rest is sustaining the whole food webs. And we have to consider very carefully these portions of food webs that we don't see. Of course, putting them all together. Unfortunately, there are specialists of gelatinous planktons, there are specialists of phytoplankton, there are specialists of fish, not very many specialists of thaliasians, and they specialists of microbes, of course, but they very seldom interact with each other, looking at the system as a whole, which is the holistic approach that is invoked continuously by the European Union and even by the scientific community in theory. Here you have the plankton cycle. The plankton cycle is the most important ecological process of the planet. And here you see it with the resting stages in the benthos. So in the winter, when the nutrients are resuspended, also the resting stages become activated and they give rise to phyto and then zooplankton. Then they go back to the bottom as resting stages. Plankton in the water column cannot be understood properly if you don't look at the version of plankton in the resting stage bank that is in the benthos, especially in coastal waters. Of course, offshore there are oroplanktonic organisms, but the more we look for the life cycles of coastal planktons, the more we find resting stages. And these are the key to understand the blooms of plankton. Usually, the perception is that plankton comes from nutrients. There are the nutrients, and then phytoplankton can develop. But phytoplankton doesn't come from nutrients. It uses nutrients, but it comes from the resting stages that are in the benthic systems. These are some of the things that inspired me for the fourth dimension. Look at the graphs on the right. This is the fisheries in a tuna trap. I made my thesis on this. If you look at the total on the bottom right, you see that there is a jagged line, but the total of the catches is more or less constant. The biomass that is mobilized doesn't change much. But if you look at the species, you will see that they have different abundances, and this is a 25 years long-term series. They change all the time. If you put them together, you have a rather constant situation, but if you split them at species level, you will see, as you can see on the left, that in time A, species A is prevalent, and species B and C are rare, but in time B, it's species B that becomes prevalent, and the others are rare, and so on. So things change with time. And this is the fourth dimension. We cannot take a snapshot of the system and hope to understand everything by just that. So we have to understand these things. There is this crystal ball because one of my challenges to the modelers is I give you 20 years of this time series, produce a model that predicts the next 5 years. We know them already, so we have the answer. Let's see if you can do it. You cannot do it. So these things are, as you cannot do it with stock exchange. So economists make beautiful models and they sell them, but I wouldn't buy them because always something strange happens that changes the course of history, because these are historical systems and episodic events can change the course of history, as we know very well, from 11th of September to the COVID to whatever, to who will win the US elections this November, the story will change. And there is not a magical model that you press a button and you have the future, not for historical systems. And ecological systems are historical systems. So what we can do is to understand the structure, understand the processes, and gain wisdom from this knowledge to depict scenarios. So we have to define now these in space. So we have to define spatial units of management and conservation, and they must be based on sound ecological grounds. We cannot base these units on our expectations. We must tailor our activities on the futures of the environment. We cannot expect that the environment will respond to our needs, to our wishes. And a way to understand what are these units is to understand connectivity. Connectivity is crucial to define the spatial units of management and conservation. Of course, we saw that the whole world is connected. So there is the Great Ocean Conveyor. But there are other parts of the planet that are more connected than the whole system. And here I have a snapshot in the Mediterranean. But then the Mediterranean can be divided in other units according to the circulation of the waters. So physics is very important. But then to the answer of the biota to these circulation patterns that change with time. So the cells of ecosystem functioning should take physics first, and then the distribution of biodiversity and the functioning of ecosystems, so as to define these units. So connectivity can be assessed in many ways. Before there are the currents, and so physics, but then we have to look at the diversity, beta diversity, how the biodiversity in different places has species in common, and the more they are in common, the more we can suppose that the systems are connected. We can look at the genetics, but we usually look at the genetics of very few species. If you increase the sampling of the species, the systems become very much more complicated. And then the fluxes of propagules and the trophic fluxes. This is explained in this picture where you see the habitats. Unfortunately, we use the habitats of the Habitats Directive, and so they are all benthic. But then you can see the propagules in the middle and the currents that transport them from one spot to the other. And you have asexual propagules, fragments, seeds, larvae, and adults that can move. So we need to understand, and this is life cycles. So we need to understand the life cycles, the matching of the presence of propagules with the current patterns and how they disperse in the environment. And these gyres or upwellings and so on connect the space, and we have to see how biodiversity answers to these physical drivers. So biodiversity patterns are generated by ecosystem processes that can be defined spatially. Connectivity occurs not only through propagule exchange, but also through food exchange. For instance, here you have the Northern Adriatic cold engine. The Northern Adriatic waters can freeze in the winter. They can reach also very often in the winter 6 degrees, while the rest of the Mediterranean in the winter is 13 degrees. So these cold waters flow along the Italian coast and then flow towards the bottom of the Ionian Sea. Where there is this yellow arrow, there are cold water corals. These corals take food from the current that comes from the Northern Adriatic. And so there is a feeding connection between the white corals of the Ionian Sea and the Northern Adriatic. You cannot manage the white corals in the Ionian Sea if you don't know what happens in the Northern Adriatic in terms of cold engine. Another connectivity route is artificial transport of species by our activities. And so this is another form of artificial connectivity that has to be taken into consideration. The Mediterranean is becoming invaded by tropical species that enter from Suez. They are considered as noxious aliens, invaders. The Great Barrier Reef is dying. It's dying because the temperatures are too high. These guys, not exactly the corals now, but some corals are arriving in the Mediterranean. The fish, the jellyfish, the algae, the crustaceans, and so on, are migrating northwards. And they enter in the Mediterranean very often to escape from harsh conditions determined by climate warming. So these guys are invaders, but they are also climatic refugees. They are escaping from a deadly situation, finding a refuge in the Mediterranean that is becoming tropical. When a coral reef will become established, what will we do? Eradicate it? No, because they are cute. But if other species are concerned, we say that we want to eradicate them. So there is a lot of thinking that must go on while considering these processes. Ecosystem processes are carried out by millions of species. It is estimated that 8 million species inhabit the planet, we named just 2 million. So the knowledge of biodiversity is incomplete. It's incomplete, and it's incomplete also the state of biodiversity. The United Nations said that 1 million species will become extinct in the next 30 years. If I ask the name of a marine species that became extinct recently, I'm sure that very few names will come out, if any. We have very long lists of threatened species, usually conspicuous species, but not one as a documented extinction. The vaquita de mar is going to become extinct in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's one. From 1 to 1 million, there is something that is missing. So we need to assess the state of biodiversity. And saying that 1 million species will become extinct might lead a politician to say, okay, if one will become extinct, 1 million will become extinct. Tell me 5 that became extinct already. And if we don't have an answer, they will not believe us. So we need to do these things, and we need to assess the structure of ecosystems much better than we are doing right now. The decade of biodiversity is ending, and now we are passing to another decade, the decade of sustainability and sustainable development. Nobody did anything in the decade of biodiversity. The expertise on biodiversity is vanishing. So we have descriptor number 1, biodiversity. 92, with the Rio Declaration, we stated that biodiversity is crucial for our survival, but we do very little to explore biodiversity. And it's not enough to say that the species is there. We can do it with metagenomics maybe, but then we need to know what species do to make ecosystems function and where. And so this is what should be a stringent priority for us. We cannot adopt several ways of protecting, managing, and exploit the marine volumes with all these measures: integrated coastal zone management, maritime spatial planning, marine spatial planning, marine protected areas, their networks, the networks of sites of community importance, and so on. We need to have an holistic approach to these things. These measures are reductionistic. The marine strategy, furthermore, which calls for an holistic approach, is adopted in different fashions by different European states. Nature doesn't care about artificial boundaries and doesn't care about bureaucracy. The cells of ecosystem functioning are a proposal of natural spatial units of management and conservation, because we must adapt our activities to nature and not vice versa. With these measures in yellow above, we are trying to adapt nature to our needs. We need to reverse this attitude, which is what the new Green Deal should do. But in order to do it, the scientific community has to produce proposals of management and conservation and frame them spatially. So we published this paper on the cells of ecosystem functioning towards the holistic vision of marine space in Advances of Marine Biology. It's not downloadable for free from the website of the journal. And if your institution doesn't have a subscription, you cannot have it. But if you write me an email, I will send you the PDF file. So the next grand challenge, going back to what the Navigating the Future 5 is talking about, is to map the structure and the function of the ocean in 4 dimensions. If it's in 4 dimensions and there is time, it means that we cannot have a single snapshot and then we are happy. We need to observe the features of the ocean constantly. And this is what is suggested in Navigating the Future. And we have to explore biodiversity. Now, think about models. The models of meteorology that lead to weather predictions are beautiful models, very complex. And we succeed in predicting the weather within 3 or 4 days. Then chaos theory explains why this is inherently impossible over the mid and long term. But these models are fed continuously with data from satellites, from meteorological stations, you name it. Without the data, we cannot keep predicting the weather just applying the models. So the models are very useful, but they have to model the relevant variables. And in this talk, I try to show what are the relevant variables. And these relevant variables must be checked constantly because things change continuously. We don't have this kind of observation system. We don't have it. And the weather is predicted with models that consider only physics. You have to put chemistry into this thing, and biology and ecology. And when you put all these things into the models, then you can try to predict the future. If the models don't turn because there are too many variables, I'm sorry, but find better models. But we cannot remove the complexity just because the models don't turn otherwise. So we need to understand the complexity of the environment. We need to explore it, both in terms of patterns and processes, and then we have to continuously look at their evolution, because evolution is the trademark of life on the planet, so nothing remains the same. And then we will try to adapt our activities to these systems a little bit better than we have been doing since now. The new Green Deal is new because it calls for a complete, a radical change in the way we understand the ecosystems and act into the ecosystems. And the radical change is to introduce this complexity in a holistic way into the picture. It's 44 minutes, and I think that this is enough for this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nando. It was great. So I see that we haven't had any questions. I don't know if anybody has any questions. Please put some questions and answers in the question and answer. The Q&A you should see at the bottom of your screen if you hover over the bottom of your screen. Nando, just because other people haven't got any questions, I definitely do. So okay. My first question is, but if you could create the perfect monitoring system for the ecosystem to really get, cells of ecosystem functioning well parameterized, what do you think is the most important thing that we need? What is the thing that we really have very little of now?
There is not one thing that is more important than others, because the things that we perceive as important now, like species A in time A, when that species is abundant, might become irrelevant in the future. And another thing that we didn't think about, the butterfly of chaos theory, might drive the systems in another direction. So very often Thaliesians are irrelevant. But if there is a Thaliesian bloom that sucks all the microbes and the crustaceans are starving, if the crustaceans starve, the fish larvae starve, and then there are less fish. If you concentrate on fish and you don't look at the Thaliesians, you don't understand the fish. So you have to include the Thaliesians in fisheries models. Not even the jellyfish are in fisheries models. Or there is jellyfish, and they are all together. But there are jellyfish that are protecting the fish, like Cotyloryza or Rhizostoma, and the fish larvae are below this jellyfish, and there are jellyfish that eat the fish larvae. So you cannot say jellyfish. And the blooms of jellyfish are very difficult to predict, and the salp jellyfish are very difficult to predict. So we cannot look only at regularities, because irregularities make things change. The models usually are focusing on regularities, and they fail continuously because the fisheries are collapsing, and we have beautiful models in fisheries, but there are no jellyfish. And there are jellyfish just as jellyfish, putting them all together. There are no Thaliasians. Come on. In the models of phytoplankton, the resting stages are not there. So before we need to know all the variables, and then we have to weight them. But, and so we might say, okay, this one is not so important, but it's not so important now, but it can become very important in the future. And if you don't consider that, then you don't understand why the system is not behaving as your model is predicting. Because these models are failing all the time. And the reason is this. If you don't consider all the relevant variables, your models are irrelevant. But for ease of analysis, larval mortality of fish is a constant. It's not a constant. So if in a model, something that is variable becomes constant, come on, it cannot work.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a couple more questions. There's a question from...
Yes, I can see them.
Yeah,
Let
me read. I'll read you the question from Sukru, saying biodiversity measurements are still labor intensive. So how can these measurements be part of the ocean observing system in the near future?
We don't have the specialists of biodiversity anymore. The biodiversity is described by taxonomists. Taxonomy is disappearing. It's disappearing. So the basic science of biodiversity is disappearing. I gave a course on hydrozoans in a university in Ireland. I learned my little animals from UK scientists. So I asked Paul Cornelius, Frederick Russell, Clifford Edwards. There was a very long list. I asked to the guys there, how comes you invite an Italian with the tradition you have? And they said, oh, there are none left. There are none left. Okay? So, of course, everybody agreed that biodiversity is important, but then we do something else. And this is strange. Descriptor number one is biodiversity is maintained. Come on. What is the state of biodiversity right now? What is the state we want to maintain? And what is, if the current state is not the one we like, what is the state we like? We don't know it, okay? We don't know it. So we should invest in these things. But it's a catch-22 issue. If there are no more taxonomists will not be in the room where decisions will be taken. And if there is a pie to share, nobody will give up a slice of the pie for people who are not in the room. And so we keep saying that biodiversity is very important, and then we keep making irrelevant models. So models are very important, extremely important, but they have to take into consideration the relevant variables. Okay, otherwise they are irrelevant. So we have to invest part of our resources also in this direction. We are not. We are not.
Okay. So we've got three more questions.
I can see them.
Yeah.
What would be the trade coin of units of ecosystem mass and flow of life cycle? I don't.
Where are you?
The trade coin.
Well, which question? So let's top one from Ivan. There's a question from Ivan Conesco Alcolea, who says, how do we start the demonstration for holistic management approach? Is it better to build demonstration for small scale systems like Micronesia or something?
We tried to do a pilot project in the Adriatic in an European program called Coconut. But the experiment is the marine strategy. If you adopt the marine strategy and you are consistent, it's something that should be done. But Italy is doing one thing. If you go in front of Slovenia or Croatia, which are on the same sea, are doing different things. So before doing these experiments, you need to have an agreement among the countries, and there is not. And there is not. So there is a lot of work to do. The cells of ecosystem functioning are an hypothesis. They are not something that, but this is the way science works. You make hypotheses and then you test them. If this one doesn't work, produce a better one. But then let's take, not that we don't, as far as I know, there are no other hypotheses. Putting things together in the way the cells of ecosystem functioning are trying to do. But now we have to work on this. Okay, we have to work on this and try to do experiments. I wouldn't do it in Macaronesia and so on. I worked in Papua New Guinea. It's not very easy to manage these places. So Europe should be a much better place. So we have the response, and we made the right laws, because the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, it has no match anywhere else. So the place where to do things is Europe. And it's up to the scientific community to propose it. But the fisheries scientists are focusing on fisheries. The plankton scientists are focusing either on crustaceans or on gelatinous plankton and so on. Benthic scientists, there are the deep sea, the coastal, the offshore. They all work on different things. Marine sciences must become marine science. And this is what we preach in Navigating the Future. So the things are shown there. The system of...
there's a question from Alva Escobar, and basically saying, congratulations, she loved your talk. I think it's a she. And she's asking the trade coin of units in the ecosystem biomass and flows of biogeochemical cycles. And
I don't understand what is trade coin. Sorry.
I think she means, what is the unit? You know, would you use carbon? Would you use wet mass? Would you use?
No, come on.
Fuels?
No.
So the question, I think that's the question. Species
and ecosystems. You cannot reduce this complexity. Species, communities, ecosystems. What is in the descriptors of good environmental status? You cannot do just biogeochemistry, and that becomes the key that opens all the doors. Come on. This carbon is expressed in different ways in different species, and these species do different things. So to make ecosystems functioning. So biogeochemistry, it's okay, but come on. We cannot say that explains everything. There is no trade coin. There are no shortcuts. We need to understand these things fully.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I don't know if we can take any of the other questions. We will keep these questions, and and we've got your name, so we can maybe ask Nando to send you the responses to these questions by email if you want. You can email us if you still want him to answer these questions or answer Nando. So thank you.
Elba, okay.
Yeah, go keep on.
Elba explained better using the ODUM approach.
Okay.
I don't agree with this approach. I don't agree with carbon. Carbon is okay, is one approach, but then we need to understand much more than biogeochemistry if we want to do things correctly. And this is a law. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive is asking for that, not for carbon.
Yeah.
It's asking for biodiversity and ecosystems very explicitly. And we are asked to do one thing and we answer with another thing. And so the problem is in the scientific community. The politicians understood. It's the scientific community that it's not ready yet.
So okay. Thank you very much, Nando. That was very interesting. I think everybody enjoyed it a lot. I certainly did. I want to thank everybody who participated, and really sorry we didn't get through all the questions, but we will keep them for you, and Nando will hopefully answer them to you. Just for those of you who are there, our next talk is on the 15th of October, and it's going to be about prehistoric underwater landscapes. So we did a document, I think it was 2014. I'm not 100% sure the time, but it's been quite a while, and it's a really interesting document. So it's something completely different about underwater archaeology. So please join us next month on the 15th of October for our third Thursday science seminar webinar. And thank you again, Nando.
Ciao, ciao. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.